Leaders from the group of 7 nations hold a 2-day summit in Italy. What was on the G7 agenda and was anything accomplished? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Leaders from Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan and the United States wrapped up their annual G7 summit over the weekend in Taormina, Sicily. It was the first time that United States President Donald Trump has attended. Britain's Prime Minister Teresa May and the newly elected French President Emmanuel Macron were also making their first appearance as leaders of their respective countries. Major topics like terrorism and trade were on the agenda, but it was climate change that made the headlines after Trump failed to commit the US to the 2015 Paris Agreement on curbing carbon emissions. That caused a split with other G7 leaders.
The whole discussion on the topic of climate was very difficult, not to say very unsatisfactory. Here, there is a situation that is 6, or if you include the EU, 7-1. That means there is so far no indication as to whether the United States will remain in the Paris Agreement or not.
Meanwhile, the host country, Italy, sought to highlight the migration and humanitarian crisis that's seen hundreds of people dying in the Mediterranean Sea while attempting to reach Europe. And there was a special session on Africa and how it can benefit from relations with the G7. Correspondent Mariam Zaidi, who was in Sicily reporting for CGTN, has that part of the story.
In the early morning, G7 leaders gathered to focus on Africa and were joined by leaders of 5 African nations: Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, Niger and Tunisia. G7 host Italy, on the front line of Europe's migration crisis, had been keen for the world's wealthiest nations to help Africa develop its economy in an effort to persuade young Africans to stay at home and not risk it all to come to Europe.
It's not going to be a philanthropic type of relationship. There is a lot South Africa can offer. Huge natural resources, young people. This is a continent that's going to push world growth in the 21st century. This is Africa's century.
Capacity building in Africa was one of the few success stories of this summit. Friday saw leaders throw their support and solidarity behind the UK in the aftermath of the devastating attacks in Manchester. G7 leaders agreeing to press technology companies and social media sites to do more to identify and remove terror propaganda. Leaders also struggled to find common ground on global trade and sanctions on Russia, and migration became but a footnote, angering some aid agencies.
Well, I think on the last day of the summit, we've got to the real scandal. G7 leaders come right here to Sicily, on the doorstep of the Mediterranean Sea, where 1,400 people have drowned just this year, and fly home tonight without having come up with any credible plan to end this vast human tragedy. That's the real scandal of this summit.
Again, that was correspondent Mariam Zaidi reporting from Sicily. Let's get to our panel right now. Joining us from Berlin is Matteo Garavoglia. He is a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution Center on the United States and Europe. With me here in the studio is Afshin Molavi. He is a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Also joining us from Providence, Rhode Island, is Vladimir Golstein. He is an analyst on Russia foreign policy, and he's a professor of Slavic Studies at Brown University. And here with us in Washington, too, is Hafed Al-Ghwell. He is a columnist with the Gulf News and Al Jazeera, and he's an expert on the political economies of North Africa. Welcome to all of you to the show. Matteo, let me start with you. Let's start with climate change. The German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, disappointed that President Trump did not support the Paris Accord. She said 6 against 1, or 7 if you count the European Union. How big a setback or failure was this for the summit?
This was, I wouldn't call it a failure in the sense that it was unfortunately expected to a certain extent. What we know is that the Italian presidency had been really working hard for a number of months to try to nail this down. And I've been talking to people back in Italy and Rome, to contacts I have over the last few days, just before the summit, and they were shocked to see that we were getting to the first day of the summit without having a clear position coming from Washington. So in a way, this was expected. Now, what is much more interesting, what we should see, is how things will move on two fronts. A, whether the Europeans will form a coalition of the willing, so to speak, with Canada, Japan, and other countries to move ahead, to keep the Paris climate change agreement on track. And secondly, how things will play out within the European Union itself. We have countries such as Sweden and Germany moving ahead and really putting political pressure on other member states to implement the agreement, and some other countries that are, let's say, looking for loopholes to maybe comply less with the substance, not only with the letter of the agreement.
Afshin, President Trump says that he will make a final decision on the Paris Accord sometime next week. But as Matteo says, will we see a coalition of the willing, as he puts it? Will the United States be increasingly isolated on this issue?
Well, I think if he ultimately does make that decision, the United States will be isolated on this issue. But you know, it's hard to tell where he's going to go on this, honestly, Anand. You know, we've seen him jawbone other deals. Remember how he was jawboning the Iran nuclear deal and describing it as the worst deal ever in the history of deals, and he's quietly kind of, you know, let that stand. But what he's done instead is he's weakened it by doing other things around the Iran nuclear deal. Could that be the model for the Paris climate deal? You also have to remember that, you know, this is an interesting case because here's a case where he can repudiate his predecessor, which is something he likes to do, and he can also, in a sense, do something that he said he was going to do, you know, which is...
Well, exactly, that's the point. I mean, should we be shocked? He's been saying this all the time.
That's right. He has been saying this all the time. Yeah. So here's an opportunity where it's almost a double win for him. He gets to repudiate Barack Obama, because this was such a centerpiece of Barack Obama's legacy, and he can do what he said he was going to do. But, you know, look, he tweeted, "I will make this decision next week," and I'm not so sure we can be so sure that he's going to unilaterally withdraw from this Paris Climate Accord.
Just keeping us in suspense again. Vladimir, we had this G7 meeting, also the NATO meeting taking place. Chancellor Merkel suggesting that after these meetings, that Germany and Europe can no longer rely on its partnership with the United States, saying, quote, and I'm quoting here, "The times in which we can rely fully on others, they are somewhat over." How does Russia view a statement like that?
Well, Russia acknowledges that there were always the problems in this union, but now they come to the surface. That Russia is way too important a player to be disregarded. So there was a temporary kind of agreement between G7. First of all, we have to remember there was G8, and then they kicked Russia out for their actions in Ukraine. And Russia, of course, is not happy because they have their own interpretation of these events, and they have to be considered on all other fronts. So this decision of G7 to push Russia aside is backfiring, and we see that within this G7 there are different takes. Furthermore, there are different takes all over the world. So Russia says that all these tensions are finally coming out, and they interpret the statement of Chancellor Merkel as an invitation to bring Russia in, and each country will be talking to them. And the very fact that President Putin is meeting with President Macron today is a sign of that. So Russia will be brought in one way or another.
Hafed, the host country, Italy, tried very hard to make the whole issue of refugees a bigger issue at the summit. It didn't succeed. It didn't get much attention at the summit. Most of those refugees, of course, coming from North Africa, West Africa, and the Middle East. Was that a failure on the part of the meeting?
I think so, because the impact of this immigration waves coming from North Africa on Europe as a whole is enormous, both economic and also political. There is also the security dimension that is impacting Europe. Somebody has to deal with this issue. Italy is at the forefront of that because most of these people land in the Italian islands in the middle of the Mediterranean, and they have to take the big chunk of it. But once they are in Italy, there isn't much you can stop them from spreading all over Europe. I think Italy is trying very hard to get an agreement in Europe, the EU, to all sort of contribute at least financially to dealing with this problem. There is also the political impact of that on North Africa and the Sahel country from which a lot of these immigrants are fleeing to Europe.
And as far as the G7 is concerned, did we see another fault line develop there? Because is the United States basically saying it's a European problem? We're not interested. President Trump has made his position very clear.
Pretty much, yes.
We're not going to be accepting refugees in the United States.
That's pretty much it. I mean, and just to tie it into the other issue you've been discussing and a few others, the danger of what Trump is doing is that he's not just taking a stand on climate change or immigration or trade. He is actually weakening the entire position of the United States globally on multiple issues. I mean, let's not forget that the entire political framework that we all live under, the world order from UN and a lot of these institutions, was an American invention. The fact that the United States is withdrawing from this global framework across the board is quite dangerous, because there is no replacement. Nobody is putting forward what will replace this order.
And Anand, you know, this issue of you know, North Africa, West Africa, and even into Southern Africa, I think this is an example of where we really need political foresight. And I think putting the issue on the agenda is important, but not just as a refugee issue. It needs to be put on the agenda as an economic issue, because no matter where you stand on the Africa is rising narrative, which we were hearing about a few years ago, Africa is not going to be able to create the number of jobs required for this very young demographic. The median age in Africa is 19. The median age in Europe is 41. That gives you a stark you know, difference. And no matter where you stand, we're not going to be able to create enough jobs. That flow is going to continue, and it's going to be with us for the next 20 to 25 years. So we need to go even beyond the refugee issue and think creatively about economic development programs across sub-Saharan Africa.
Go ahead.
I'd like to step in and just make 2 points. One, concerning migration, one of the objectives of the Italian presidency was indeed not to talk just about the migrants and refugee crisis, but to highlight the potential positive issues that can come out of migration in terms of economics, trade, and incentives, and trying to put a positive spin on the value and what positive can come out of migration. This was pretty much shot down by President Trump. A second point that I would like to make is that I think there is a silver lining to all this. I think President Trump is unwillingly contributing to European unity, so to speak. What we see is a situation whereby, for instance, Chancellor Merkel has been renewing her efforts and through back channels, together with Rome, with Italians, to try to forge a common European position, led, interestingly, by Berlin and Rome when it comes to managing migration flows in the Mediterranean, and we'll see more of that coming up in the following months in stabilizing Libya. Chancellor Merkel has realized that she cannot expect much support from the United States, and so she's trying to forge a European consensus together with the Italians. So there's a silver line there in the sense that Trump is contributing to European unity.
Afshin, another issue, and this was at the NATO summit, and this was who pays for NATO?
Right.
President Trump there openly criticizing other NATO members, saying that they're not coming up with the required money that for the organization. That led a former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Ivo Dalda, to say that today the United States is heading into a direction on key issues that seems diametrically opposed of where Europe is heading. Again, on this NATO issue, it's something that Trump has mentioned again and again on the campaign trail and after he became president as well. But do you agree that the U.S. and its other NATO partners are heading in opposite directions?
Well, I think, you know, to Hafed's point earlier about, you know, the post-World War II international architecture, which was really underwritten by the United States and led by the United States, I'm not so sure President Trump has internalized that yet. And I'm not so sure, you know, by focusing so incessantly on paying your dues, I think he's obscuring the strategic value of NATO for the United States. It's actually valuable for the United States to be a leader of NATO the way the United States is. It's valuable for the United States to have created this post-World War II international architecture, which has largely benefited the United States as well. So I think while there may be a divergence, again, what we'll have to decide is how much of this is the New York real estate state developer, jawboning and negotiating ahead of time, and how much are we going to see substantive policy change?
He also didn't mention, or reinforce rather, the key NATO doctrine of collective defense.
Yes, yeah, and that certainly, you know, raised some eyebrows. But again, he didn't he didn't deny it either.
Vladimir, Russia used to be, as we've been talking, a member of the G8 until it was expelled over its role in Ukraine and in Crimea. Now there's talk of new sanctions against Russia. Is anyone in Moscow losing sleep over the threat of new sanctions?
Not really. They basically want, you know, the Russian representative at EU said that G7 more or less overextended its time. We are not in a rush to join G8. What's important is much bigger organization meetings of G20, which include China, include other uprising powers. And that's what they're interested in. And they also understand that this is all just talk, because, you know, on the one hand, G7 said that there is a possibility of sanctions, but they also stress that it's important to talk to Russia, and that's what Russia wants to stress. They want to negotiate with each country, and the Russians, similar to China, they're aware that the situation has changed since the time of this post-war architecture was in place. NATO, EU, these are all kind of relics of the Cold War, when the Europe was threatened by, you know, Soviet Union. This is not the reality anymore. So what I've heard is this criticism of Trump as if not understanding something, but my feeling is that Europeans also don't want to understand the situation change. How can they talk about, you know, security in Europe when they don't bring Russia to the table? How can they talk about, you know, environmental changes, climate changes, when Russia is the biggest country in the world, is not considered? This is just, you know, a little bit naive. So maybe Trump, and along with England, kind of realizes the situation change and things have to be, you know, reconsidered. While Germany and France, who clearly benefited from this post-war situation, they still try to cling on to the vision of the past. So Russia is sort of thrown in the middle until Europeans and its other partners will figure out what they want to do with the situation.